Welcome to A Human Perspective, a podcast where I'll be sharing work and personal experiences and learnings. I will also chop it up with guests from time to time who will also share their own perspectives. I can't promise everything you hear on this podcast will always be right, but I can promise to always give you a human perspective. My name is Lola Oguntoken, and I'm your host. Let's go. Welcome to this episode of A Human Perspective. Our guest today is Jack Villiers. Jack is a leadership coach, men's guide, and public speaker. And today we have a very interesting topic, or at least one that I'm excited about, which is masculinity and men's health. Thank you for joining me today, Jack. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
So I first came across Jack quite a number of years ago when he was working with Just Eat. And I came across him again when I was recruiting for another company in the tech space. I've always been aware of Jack, and I remember seeing a post that Jack shared. I think it was the back end of last year, which had a group of people standing in a circle, quite a number of people, I think in the middle of a rural space or forest. That's where I understood that Jack was actually doing work with men around masculinity and their health. And I was just really taken back by the image. It was quite moving to see. I think it was quite amazing to see the kind of shift you've made over time as well.
Yeah.
And this being the focus. So I think maybe a good place to start would be to get an understanding of you and your background and how you've gotten into this space.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. The image was actually a retreat that I led with a number of other men in Devon last December.
Right.
And I think there was about 70 or 80 of us there in this stone circle. It's cool photography, right? It's a drone shot.
I will be sharing it, by the way.
Yeah, for sure.
Promo.
It's a cool shot.
It's
and
amazing.
to tell you a little bit about me. So as you so well introduced me, I'm a leadership coach, men's guide, and public speaker. And really my mission at the moment is to make healthy masculinity mainstream. And the way that I do that, there's kind of three ways. So one of them is coaching men, particularly men in leadership. So founders, executives, just leaders, coaching them not only to increase their impact, but also how do they embody healthy masculinity. And the reason that I focus on men in leadership is because it's not because they're better than men that aren't in some form of leadership role, but it's really because the impact that they can make if they're running a company of 500 people is pretty huge if they show up better than they are at the moment. So that's one way. The other way is through public speaking. I guess I'd say it's now become the intersection of leadership, masculinity, and then kind of dovetailing into things like mental health and inclusion, which I didn't think would all become one thing, but for me it's like converged in this really beautiful way. So I do a lot of speaking and workshops, and then finally, as you saw in that image, I run transformational experiences for men. Mainly I work with a movement from the US called Sacred Sons, and we run retreats all over the world. So I've been doing that for a few years now, and the idea of that is really to allow men to heal things like their trauma, again, to train them on how they can embody more healthy masculinity and to connect deeper to themselves, to other men, and to their masculinity.
This is quite a rare route to take and get to for people that have had recruitment backgrounds.
Yeah, for sure. I'll start with, I fell into recruitment. I got kicked out of school, which never worked for me. And I ended up finding a random apprenticeship on Gumtree that then sent me to a recruitment company. I turned up on my first day, 17, in like a very bad suit with lots of gel in my hair. And they were like, here's a phone, here's a database. You're going to recruit software engineers. And that was how I got into recruiting and tech. And I had a really amazing career moving in towards like a head of talent role and leading recruitment at companies like Monzo. And then after I left there, I set up my own business. And that was where over the years, when I was leading teams, I realized I was like, oh, this thing when I ask people questions or I like mentor them, oh, that's what a coach does. So then I trained as a coach. But after I left Monzo, as well as going and consulting as like a head of people, head of HR, I was doing a lot of leadership coaching. So having my own one-to-one practice, coaching the executives and the leaders in the companies I was working at. And my work came, I would say, a bit more focused around like learning and development and running training programs. So over that time, I was kind of developing my ability as like a leadership coach and trainer. I then launched Lead, which is an accelerator for leaders in startups and scale-ups. So that was like one side of the story. But along that journey, although I experienced a lot of success and had the things and my family and a house and a nice car, whatever it was, I just kind of felt in myself, I was like, I'm just still not happy. Like I don't feel that fulfilled. And really what that was this gap of where I hadn't actually healed a lot of things that had happened in my life, especially relating to my father, which obviously then relates heavily to my masculinity. And so I kind of went on this, you know, without sounding too woo-woo, I went on this healing journey where I really reconnected to that. And that's where I found men's work and going really deep into that. And I think after a while of participating in men's work and going on these transformational experiences, it was like, oh, wait, I have like 10 years of leading in some of the best companies in the world. And I can use that here. And, you know, then my knowledge of like masculinity and all of that kind of stuff. And just, I guess the way that I was showing up as a man, like leveled up. I guess I would say it was like a quantum leap over the past, you know, couple of years. And now over the last year, these worlds have converged. And it's like, okay, great. I can kind of be the bridge of bringing this to companies because I speak the language and I've been there and done it. And I really see this as a big thing that needs to happen if we want to create better workplaces among a better world.
For those like myself who don't know, what is men's work?
So men's work, it can look a number of different ways, but the way that I would explain it is physical, relational, emotional practices, different modalities, and bringing those together with the focus and intention of allowing men to heal. Particularly, it could be anything, but often, it's relating to their masculinity and also to how they can be a better man. How can they be more balanced? How can they be more in touch with their emotions? How can they be a better support for the people that they need to support? And the one thing I want to call out here, just because we're going to say the word masculinity a lot, is that masculinity does not mean the absence of femininity. To be a healthy masculine is to be in balance of your masculine and your feminine. So me saying that I'm in my healthy masculine is actually because I'm very in touch with the feminine parts of myself and the masculine parts. And I know how to dial those in different ways depending on what I'm experiencing. So men's work is the focus of creating that healthy masculinity and balance. And the thing that really underpins it all is men supporting men. Because what I experienced throughout my career especially, and also just growing up where I did in my life, was we were always in competition. How can I have more than him? How can I take the piss out of him? How can I look better than him? All of these things. And that's a big part of toxic masculinity in our society. So really when men come together and do this work and they support each other, actually just seeing men around you supporting you is like in itself just the biggest moment.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what men's work is for me. But, you know, there's lots of different flavors of how it's done. There's some amazing movements doing men's work, not just the one that I'm part of. And the last thing I'll say, history lesson in 10 seconds, is like, it's been around since probably like forever, right? This is like an old way, men gathering and doing these things together. But our society's forgotten, you know?
And I don't know whether it's real schooling or just subliminal messages that we're given, but there is this understanding that the way that we were before was very primal, it was very basic, it was very backwards. And actually, I completely agree with you. I feel like we've forgotten some fundamentals of just being. And there are all these labels that we're taking on or challenging or trying to break down or trying to work out if they apply to us. And I particularly love the point that you made around masculinity and femininity, because I think people have an idea of what that looks like. So for instance, a typical example is if you're feminine, you're weak. Actually, says who? What is that based on? Are you basing that on science? Because science would probably say something very different. Why does one have to be up and the other one down, or the one good, the other one bad, strong, weak, etc.? And actually there's duality in everything. There are parts of me more masculine than feminine, depending on the scenario that you put me in. And there are various reasons for that. There's upbringing. There's just what life has thrown at you and how you've managed to cope with it. I love the duality that you talk about and just coming into balance, whatever that looks like for you, and accepting that and acknowledging that and knowing that it's fine.
Yeah.
So how do you feel? Because most men have not done this work. Most men are not ready to do this work. How is this showing up in the workplace?
First thing I want to say, kind of like a disclaimer, is just because I've been doing men's work and this is, my real focus now, it doesn't mean that I'm a better man than the next man. Like, part of doing this work is that I'm constantly shining a light on the parts of me that need to improve,
Yeah.
So it's like when we're doing this work, whether I'm leading it or not, I'm doing this work with the men. We're always going to be a work in progress. The work doesn't end. So I want to call that out because I think it's important for men who are listening, especially, to hear. So yeah, I think as you said, especially in the workplace, this is quite alien in a way. And my experience, as well as I've spoken to men who haven't done this work before, it goes two ways, or it goes a couple of different ways. But often the things that come up is quite a lot of like resistance. Like, no, I don't want to do that. Even with my closest friends that I grew up with, men in my family who know I do this and are not necessarily, they're like, no, that's not for me. Often that resistance is what creates the curiosity. And often it's like, oh, I see this man, the way he's holding himself, the way he's doing things. Like, I'm curious about that. So that resistance can become curiosity. And also it can just be for men and even for women as well, quite triggering. For women, often I get this thing of like loaded men doing like quite primal stuff. Sometimes also like that sounds really... When men gather, it's like often been like at the pub and, to talk shit or whatever. So for me, the way this shows up in the workplace is I think it's just not really in the collective awareness. And I think a lot of things that I've experienced or witnessed from the very top of companies all the way through are actually like quite toxic masculine behaviors that are then creating a lot of the problems that we see in the workplace. So I'm going to give you some examples. So one of the big topics at the moment is burnout, right?
Yeah.
Like people burning out, all of that kind of stuff. So the energy I believe creates burnout is this need to constantly win and achieve at all costs and to dominate and to do it and to have done the thing. And that's very masculine, the kind of building. Women have it as well, again, but like this is a masculine quality. And the problem is that quality is so focused on grow at all costs, especially in industries like tech. And that's why we have burnout, because everyone's embodying that same thing and then they're ending up burning out, right? Whereas actually the feminine counterbalance of this would be like nurture, receiving, taking a step back, thinking about it, that's like the more feminine quality on the other side, right? The polarity. So for me, that's just an example of the way that it shows up. And really, there's just statistically some facts, right? Like if we look at tech, which again, I've got most experience in, so I like to use it as a reference point. It's like 80% of companies on average are men, right? A male in the workforce, right? And then if you go to leadership and you look at how many like women or people who don't identify, just don't identify as male or in leadership roles, executive roles, it's even less, right? So the thing is, this unbalanced masculine dominance isn't creating space in the workplace for diversity to thrive. If we want to really create more inclusive companies and we want to see more people who don't identify as male in leadership, then the men need to become more balanced. And everyone's worked with an executive or a founder, if you've worked in a startup, who's just like super bullish, like doesn't have the time, stress, all of it. I think every startup I've worked in has had one. So it's like, that's how it shows up in the workplace for me. And it's just like, once I was aware of it, I was like, oh shit, like this has happened everywhere I've worked in some, I'm not saying that means the company's bad. It's just the society that we're living in, right?
You tend to see it exacerbated in startups just because there's so few people. So everything is much more intense, as well as the need to survive. And I think what has been taught to these leaders or CEOs is be aggressive and push forward. There's a space for that, but it's when it happens unconsciously, that's where there's the disconnect. So even if we're to take it back to times where life was much more simpler, when you did go out and work, there was purpose. You were bringing food home or something, but what's happening now is it's much more about this invisible thing, money, so that we can buy useless things.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And so everything is empty, so to speak. And this is the culture that people have been bred on, which is go, 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 get. Even the people that grow up within that culture believe that is the way to build and create and grow a successful company. A lot of these leaders hire people similar to themselves because, again, they believe it's these characteristics that get us there. And a lot of business is done with the same personality types, which enables them to continue growing, etc. I just think the idea of having a company and understanding the responsibility to the people within that company, yes, you want people to achieve things. Yes, you definitely have to have some form of goal. You've got to stretch people. You've got to challenge people. That's a healthy thing to do. But are you doing it consciously or just because you believe this is the way it should be? How much real in-depth thought is going into it? That's what I've often seen is missing. People are much more about what do others perceive as opposed to what is really going on. What do we really need to do in order to make this successful? The culture is imploding now.
Yeah, for sure.
That's why there's so many companies letting people go, because thinking about what it looks like on the outside and just growing for the sake of growing is one of the ways in which that's showing up, because it's got to be bigger and bigger and bigger and better. That's not success.
100%. Yeah, and this is a really big one for me, right? Like, having had a background in talent, when I'm constantly seeing like all these layoffs and having been in companies when COVID happened and having to pull the plug on things and all of that stuff. That's it. We're trying to grow at all costs. And it's like, as soon as we see the headway, we're just like, step on the gas. I've worked with some founders that I genuinely have seen, it's not necessarily they've been doing men's work, like male founders who have then, maybe they just have that awareness or that balance of taking time to think and how do they nurture the team they have before they add a ton of people to it and stuff like that. But there is this kind of overall feeling, especially if you look at the biggest tech companies and companies in the world, of just like grow, and then this is what we end up with, right? It's not sustainable. The entire system that we've created is out of balance, but I do feel that things like COVID have really disrupted that now, although it's also had some really damaging effects. It has made people think more like, oh, we got to think about this differently. So I'm hoping in this time now, like a bit of a catalyst of naturally balancing out this kind of very like masculine dominated approach to business with more of a balanced approach.
Yeah. One area that not all men, but some men are not too great with is communication. And when I say communication, I mean around things that may make them appear to be vulnerable. Now, you're getting large groups of men together, and I'm assuming that there's this need to be open and vulnerable and to get people to do all those things that they don't naturally do day to day in the outside world. How do you get that to happen? How does that even work? Because literally my mind is blown. How do you get there?
Well, the first thing is, if they've signed up to come to an experience like that and they've even just arrived at the experience, that's the first step. because
True.
because they've whether they've had resistance or things have triggered them, they're there. They've committed to being there and they've committed to going into it. And that's the first step, that they've realized, like, cool, however good in the like material world my life is going, however I'm feeling, like I'm here to look for something more, and that can be different things for many men. Really, the first way of doing this is actually getting men to just take off the masks and the projections, because as we move through life, especially as men, like I mentioned, this competition, and we do this with everyone, right? Not just men to men, but it's like, you know, we have these projections and, oh, they must be like this because of this, and things that people say and they see. So especially with connective and relational practices, getting them to start taking off some masks, like looking each other in the eyes. I remember when I started doing this work, and I remember looking this man in the eyes in this opening part of this retreat, and I was like, I don't think I've looked another man in the eyes this way for like since I can remember, you know? And if you look, especially when you're in, I don't live in London anymore, but I experience this now when I go back to London, it's like no one really makes eye contact with each other. We're all just like going and doing our thing. So, you know, even just, you know, we don't talk too much openly about exactly what we do, but like, you know, getting them to look in the eyes and to start sharing things with each other, right? And just starting to like share and take off those masks, because this is the thing I find really interesting in those spaces and with the men that I coach, right? I've been in experiences where you've got a guy who's like, you know, CEO, top entrepreneur, top of his game. Then next to him, you've got a person who kind of just, you know, is like working the 9 to 5. You've got a stay-at-home dad. You've got a young man that just came out of university. You've got someone who is like a hippie and lives in a tent. You've got another man who's just come out of prison. And all of these men in society, we see them as so different, walks of life, very diverse as well. And they realize very quickly when they start to share and take off those masks, and obviously doing it in a way that's a bit gradual, right? But also quite intense to kind of like get them into the experience. They're suddenly all looking at each other like, oh shit, you're going through like exactly the same thing that I'm going through. So doing that, and then of course, as it goes into an experience like this, it goes a lot deeper, and there can be more, not just the connection and stuff, but also like the confrontation. Men sometimes need healthy confrontation. How do you handle confrontation? Are you not willing to set a boundary if someone's confronting you, or, you know, so a lot of different things, but really it's about taking off the masks. And it's not so different when I work with men in leadership and doing one-to-one coaching. Often the man will approach me and we'll work together because you've had a great career in startups and scale-ups. I'm a CEO of a Series B startup. We're scaling really fast. I want business, high performance, advice, that kind of thing. And I'm like, cool, totally, I can do that. But then often it's, oh, actually, I want to connect to something deeper. I don't feel fulfilled. And again, it's about taking off those masks of like, you don't have to be the CEO on the front of TechCrunch. That's not actually the essence of who you are. That's something that you're doing, and that's great. What's underneath that? And that's where I really find things like vulnerability for men become like a superpower in your leadership, because you're actually able to leverage something that's a bit deeper than just the status, the achievements, that kind of thing.
Have you had the chance to see a leader, a CEO, someone who's top of their business do this retreat and then see what they were like before and after? What are some of the key changes you've seen in terms of their interaction with people overall? And more interestingly, their interactions with women. Like, have they recognized as well that actually what they've been holding inside and not realizing was there potentially is actually impacting how they perceive women in the workplace as well?
That's a really, really interesting question. The first thing I always call out, and I say this often when I'm leading one of these experiences for men, is one retreat can change your life. It can change the course of your life. One peak experience where you go really deep into something and you do what needs to be done. However, it's about repetition. This is like, I hate to use the really boring analogy of like going to the gym or eating healthy, but it's like, you can't just do it once a year and okay, yeah, that's good. It's better than not doing it at all. It's about continued personal development, work and commitment. And often that is really self-awareness, understanding what things are coming up, where they're coming from, self-inquiry, support, all of those things. So I wanted to call that out. Every man that I've ever worked with on a retreat or been in a retreat space with and been like close enough to see them in the space and then see them leave the space has always left a better man than the one that arrived, period. And I have seen that with men coming from very successful careers where they're running businesses. The impact that I see is that they're a lot more open, and in any ways that they weren't showing up in a good way, they've either started to like work on that and move through that, which is then benefiting the people that are working for them, or at least they've identified it so they can start there. Because I'm not then close with these men in the sense of going and seeing exactly what changes in their business, but seeing the way that they then progress if they come to other experiences or they do more training. You just see that every time they're coming back, they've leaped into a newer version of themselves. I can speak for myself though. I definitely feel when I think about being like an entrepreneur and running my business, I am just 10 times more effective. And recently I had a successful consulting business, people consulting business in tech. And through this work, I realized I was like, this isn't what I want to do anymore. And even though it was a great business that made me money and all of that stuff, I just was like, I'm not happy doing this. And I was able to throw it in the bin and start something that now is really lighting me up and I enjoy doing. And when I interact with like clients, with people that I coach, you know, every time that I'm going through in this personal development and making these leaps, well, I'm seeing how much more impact I can make on them, right? Because of my awareness and the tools that I have. So it's like a ripple effect is the way I would describe it.
Is there a woman's work? I'm probably going to look it up and see. Oh, fantastic. I'm definitely going to look into that. At the beginning, you mentioned that something that is key to men's health is actually men supporting other men. So not being in competition. There's that part that men play with each other and how that actually elevates them as human beings. But I think then there's this other part. So again, let's give an example. I don't know, maybe a heterosexual relationship or even friendship, and the interaction with a woman as well, because I do feel that there is also an impact there as well. What I'm trying to ask is, without sounding weird, is what do women maybe need to be aware of when they are interacting with men, whether it's at home or at work? What do we need to be aware of? Because I think there is this perception that men are very strong and they're able to just handle everything and they should handle everything and take complete ownership. Or when you perhaps see a man perhaps not demonstrating these, and I'm going to say quote unquote because I hate the term, but alpha male acts, does that make him less of a man? So what do we also need to do? What do we need to change within our own perception, or perhaps work on within our own perception, to ensure we're also being more supportive? Because any relationship can be destructive, regardless of whether it's coming from another man or someone else.
Yeah, I love this question. And yeah, I appreciate you asked in the previous question around women. So yeah, this is a really good area to jam on. So we're moving into a new paradigm of masculinity. And in that paradigm, I feel like for women, it's about understanding that what we've been taught are a man's needs and not necessarily a man's needs, you know? Like the same things that might be nourishing for women, like, you know, if we're going with stereotypes, right? But masculine, feminine, but just calling it out. So men also need emotional connection and nourishment and support and love and compassion. They don't just need like hard discipline or this other type of stuff. So for me, which is like, I guess kind of one of my values, you could say, is really like balance. As a woman, asking yourself for the feminine, the really feminine parts of me, what is it that nourishes me, that allows me to feel supported, and knowing that men need that as well. And one of the hardest things I find with men is simply just to communicate their needs. Men just, I was in so many relationships, I've been in so many work situations where I just couldn't communicate my needs. I just was like, gotta get on with it, gotta do it. So I think the most powerful question that a woman can ask a man, whether that's a man they're in a romantic relationship with or in the workplace they think might be having a tough time, how are you doing? What do you need right now? How can I support you? Right? Because that really softens and opens, right? And I'm not saying that all men are going to take that, and necessarily it depends where they're at. I think it's about women understanding that men aren't what our society has exactly portrayed them as, and what a lot of the things we've been conditioned and taught. Like, men do have emotional needs as well. They do have these softer parts of them, and some men are in touch with that, other men not so much. And then I think there's a really big thing, and I'm really actually just excited to see how this is going to go down this year with the work I'm going to do in organizations, and it's already getting a really great response. But especially in organizations, are women willing to let men to gather as men together, you know? So it's like, and I know you'll have a lot of experience in the same area as me, you know, we have these we have different like employee representation groups around, you know, different elements. And I'm not saying that men need an employee representation group, it's not quite the same context. But if I was to come into your organization and say, hey, I want to gather all of the men and I'm going to run a men's circle with them to get them to talk about like where they're at as a man, what they're struggling, that would be massive. That, what I've seen is massively triggering, but it's massively triggering for some women, because it's like, again, it's women need to give men the permission to like do this work. And one of the most amazing things that I've seen is encouragement from women. So like, so many men that come on the retreats that I do, even men that I've coached, has been because like their friend, their partner, their sister, their wife has been like, hey, there's this dude over there doing this stuff, but it seems like men are really vibing it and they're happier and they're more embodied and expressive and fulfilled. And then like these men get as a gift to go on this experience or to do some work with me, and then they're really, really thankful. So that's to me what support from women looks like.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question around, would organizations be comfortable with men getting together and supporting each other in a way that is different from what we know within a commercial environment? And it's interesting because something that I started with my current company is, I call it something terrible, but it's because we go for dinner. So I call it dinner ladies, okay? But it's just a chance to connect as women. That's all. Just to do something outside of work as women so people don't feel alone. And it's just a chance to talk to someone. There was kind of a conversation around it, like, should we even do this? And I said, but I don't see why men can't do it too. And I think it is done, but not in a purposeful way. So it's, oh, let's grab a drink, let's grab a pint and have a chat then. But actually, can it be more organized? And is there room for that to happen? I think so. I think people just maybe don't know that they can. Around the triggering piece, I think that is a very interesting question, because I can imagine in some tech cultures where minority groups have been made the priority, it may be. But for me, if we're not all doing the work, then what's the point? We've all got work to do, all of us.
Yeah, it's individual work for collective change, right? And this is some of the talks that I do. One of the ones that I'll be giving this year is allyship through healthy masculinity. Life and society is somewhat like a pendulum. Over the last however many hundred years, the pendulum has been, since the industrial age, is like masculine dominated, male, misogyny, all of these things, right? And almost what's happened in some places now is the pendulum has swung and it's out of balance, because now it's like, man, you're terrible, and and all of that kind of stuff. And that's now damaging. And actually, again, going back to this thing that we're talking about, it's like, we need the balance. Women need space to gather as women. Men need space to gather as men. Whatever you identify as, trans spaces, non-binary spaces, spaces for people of color, all of these things are necessary. It doesn't mean that we should have one over another. All of them have their place to be among people that can relate to what they're experiencing, and then we should all be coming together, right? So again, it's like individual work for collective change. So like, you know, the only thing I would say, caveat around men gathering is when men come together, it kind of needs to be in this way anyway, depending on what the intention is and what's being talked about, is like there needs to be some facilitation sometimes, because otherwise it can go into the shadow side of that masculinity. And I'm sure that's again like the same, maybe, you know, different, but the same for women. So it's like the question I'm asking myself is, how can I bring this in a way that isn't just like, let's do it for the sake of it, but like is really productive for organizations, and so men can be in the conversation of how they support others while also supporting themselves. And that means gathering and having conversations. That's not about excluding people. That's about, again, coming together with shared experience.
Yeah. And how do LGBTQ community, or how do gay men fit into men's work or this type of space and work? Because quite often they don't necessarily feel safe around other men when it comes to being themselves.
That's a great question.
You know, is that something that's even possible?
Yeah, it's definitely possible, because I've experienced it it at pretty much all the retreats that I take part leading and facilitating in. As a heterosexual man, I'm not going to speak to what a homosexual man's experience is, because I'm not in their body. And at the same time, without going into too much detail, like I've seen that for men who do identify as homosexual, that's come with a lot of different challenges that again will be unique to them, and then also unique to them being an individual person. But what it is it's about, can the collective of that group of men make it inclusive? And also, when you're going into a space where you're creating such a level of realness that if a man, say a heterosexual man, had something come up in them where they were feeling like a projection or homophobia to another man, actually, like so much in society, then it'd be like, cancel them, blame them, where it's actually like, okay, well, can we bring this man out, and can they talk about it, and can we like actually have a conversation that's really healing about it? So in these experiences, I've seen like world issues of like war and you know, things like that between men from different cultures, like healed in a way, because they're coming together in this way as just men. So definitely a place for it. I think, of course, it's important that whoever's holding the space to be aware and to make sure that those men are supported in the way that they need support. But I'm happy to say that I've seen it a lot, which is really special.
That's brilliant. I love the fact that people aren't shot down, you know, if they have an opinion that perhaps a lot of people aren't comfortable with or they don't think is right. Because it does feel these days that if you don't say the right thing, there's no space for it. You get shut down, people are marginalized. And I think that is so dangerous. It's really important that we pull everyone in and everyone says what they need to say, and we break it down and understand each other. We don't have to always agree, but there should be some level of respect there. I love the fact that you do actually give them a platform, because they're probably expecting to have to defend themselves rather than be understood, which is what everyone is looking for.
And you know what, the way that we say this in the work that I do and what we say at Sacred Sons is, it's not about calling people out, it's about calling them in. If there's like an issue with someone, or someone said something that's offended you or whatever, it's not like, or someone said something and everyone's like, whoa, it's not about calling them out and blaming cancer. It's like, call them in. Okay, what came up for you? What is it that you were feeling in that moment? What was your intention? How else is that showing up for you? Do you know? And that's so different, inviting someone in to actually heal. And this is, again, you know, I feel like between us we could go very into the like societal stuff, but it's like, when we approach these problems with the same energy that created the problem, with like blame, anger, shame and distrust, and when that's a problem, and then we approach solving the problem with the war on drugs, the war on COVID, all of these things, well, of course there's just going to constantly be wars, because we're warring on everything. Whereas actually what we need to do is we need to heal, we need to have conversations, we may need to grieve, we may need to do this, we need to connect. So it's coming into connection, not separation. And that's at every level, from man to man, woman to man, person to person, colleague to colleague, workplace to workplace. It's about coming into connection and collaboration.
That is perfect. And even as you said that, I was like, oh, it's like more of an embrace as opposed to someone feeling like they have to get their dukes up. The shift in energy by calling people in, you know, it just even changes the dynamic of the conversation taking place. I wish there was more of that. And it also makes me think, to be honest, personally about, what can I do to call people in more, as opposed to protecting myself by putting up a wall.
Yeah, one thing I talk a lot about when I'm training leaders on the programs that I've run, or if the topic of feedback comes up, for me, that's what feedback is. When you're going to give someone constructive feedback, it's about calling them in. I mean, I love what Brene Brown says. She has a engaged feedback checklist where it's like, I'm ready to sit next to you and look at the problem. I'm ready to remove assumptions, projections, and like come into this with the idea of collaborating. When it comes to feedback in the workplace, it's if we call each other in and we look at the problem in front of us and we collaborate and we forget that actually our intentions are good and state that our intentions are good, there's a completely different dynamic shift than just you didn't do that well and I didn't like it, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, this notion of calling in, I think, is really powerful in every setting.
As well as calling in, perhaps not even having any expectations of that other person either. So just letting them be. Because I think that's the other half of it that makes it so difficult. If I do this, then what are you going to do? It feels like there's this constant need for an exchange in our society. And actually, what happens when there's no need for that?
Yeah. And it's acceptance. When I work with founders and leaders, often they'll say to me, or some of the topics that might come up is like, my investors are being really, really challenging. I've got this particular investor. Here's what's going on. Or like, I'm reporting to the CEO and this is really challenging. And there's a piece here around acceptance of like, great, let's call them in. Let's work on the best solution to get this relationship working in a better way. But as human beings, we need to accept that we can't control other people. And as soon as we release ourselves from this thing that if I do all these things, I'm going to be able to like control the outcome. As soon as we're like, I can do all these things to get to the outcome I want, but knowing that people are individual and they will make their own decisions and you can't have people be the way that you want them to be. They are the person that they're at where they're at, they're dealing with the shit that they've got, right? So I always say this, it always comes up. It's like, yes, let's make a plan. Yes, okay, great. This is how you're going to approach this investor. But actually, let's just accept they might not change. How do you resource yourself to handle that situation? Or is it a case of a situation where maybe you can just say, actually, I'm not going to be in this situation anymore? So acceptance, it's really important.
So can you tell people about some of the work that you do and how they can find out more about you and what you do and perhaps, even sign up to one of your retreats?
Yeah, for sure. As I mentioned, I've just gone through this like evolutionary process of throwing a load of things that were still good, but throwing them in the bin. The work that I'm doing right now, really the focus is on that convergence point of leadership and masculinity. And the way that I do that is I do one-to-one coaching and group coaching programs, mainly focusing on men in leadership. So often the men I work with right now are founders, CEOs, leaders in all different types of industries. I do tend to have a lot of men in tech because I've spent a long time in tech. It's coaching, but I bring in a lot of different modalities and somatics and different things like that. So it's not just like traditional coaching. If I have to be cliche, it's quite holistic. So yeah, if you're a man who's in that space and you're interested in increasing your impact and tapping into your healthy masculine self, then that's for you. I still do work with executive teams of obviously all mixed genders, but that's just specific companies, a few different ones a year. Public speaking, yeah, again, I mainly speak about leadership, masculinity, but that really does broaden into like organizational culture, mental health, because of my experience. I kind of merge those together, but leadership and masculinity is the focal point. And then in terms of retreats, the focus of my work is with an organization called Sacred Sons. So many thousands of men have done work with Sacred Sons now. They're an incredible organization. They do work with youth, young men as well. So men from age 9 to 17.
Wow.
In Europe already this half of the year, we've had 12 or 13 events. In America, there's even more. So like, honestly, if you're a man who wants to come into one of these experiences and is curious about it, then you can check out Sacred Sons to see more of their work. And also there just will be an event somewhere near you. I do my own workshops and retreats. I'm going to be working on more of those second half of the year. So they'll be on my website as well. Yeah, that is pretty much it. So like, yeah, coaching, speaking, experiences.
What's your website?
It's jackvilliers.com and that's spelled VILLIERS.
Amazing. Well, Jack, thank you so much. That really was a riveting conversation. I had to hold myself back a bit because I was like, oh, Lola. But no, it was really good to just have an open conversation, just generally about masculinity and how that balances or comes into interaction with anyone, as well as femininity, particularly in the workspace and with leaders. So thank you so much for your time. I'm sure everyone's going to enjoy the episode.
Thank you so much for having me. Great conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, Jack.
Bye.
Bye.